The night I remember most did not arrive loudly. It did not come with gunshots or screaming wind, or the kind of trouble men later brag about surviving. It came quietly, carried on the breath of the desert, settling beside a low fire that burned as if it understood the importance of keeping its voice down. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can see how the flames leaned and straightened, leaning again like they were listening. I was younger then, or perhaps simply less aware of how moments decide the shape of a life, and I did not yet know that some questions, once asked, never truly leave you. Hanska Cole sat across the fire that night, his hat resting on the ground beside him, his hands folded together as if he were holding something fragile inside them. He was 30 years old, though the lines etched into his face made him look older when the firelight caught them just right. Those lines were not carved by laughter or easy living. They came from squinting into sunrises that promised work but never comfort, from swallowing words when speaking would cost more than silence, from learning early that the world does not hurry to make room for men like him. As I watched him, I could feel the familiar weight he carried, the kind that settles into a man's bones when he has learned to expect little and receive even less. People in the nearby town of Dry Creek knew Hanska well enough to use him and little enough to know him. They called him reliable when a fence needed mending, invisible when the pay was handed out, and dangerous only in the way that loneliness sometimes is. He was the man asked to sleep in the barn, not the house, the man trusted with horses but not with opinions. Hanska accepted these arrangements with a nod and a quiet thank you, as if gratitude itself might be the price of survival. Still, there were nights when the silence pressed too hard against his chest, when he wondered if being overlooked long enough could turn a man into something transparent. Across from him sat Taza Red Elk, 50 years old and carrying his age with a steadiness that made younger men uneasy. His back was straight, not from pride, but from habit earned through years of standing his ground when retreat would have been easier. Gray threaded through his dark hair, which fell loose over his shoulders, and his face held the kind of calm that comes from having already lost what mattered most and still choosing to live with purpose. Taza did not fidget. He did not rush. He sat as if time itself had agreed to slow down for him, and in that stillness, he commanded more attention than any raised voice ever could. The fire crackled softly, sending sparks upward where they vanished into the night, and Hanska shifted his weight, suddenly aware of the dust on his boots and the way his palms dampened despite the cool air. He had been summoned to the camp without explanation, and the not knowing gnawed at him more fiercely than any accusation. Curiosity stirred inside him, restless and uneasy. Why call for a man who belonged nowhere, and why choose a night like this, when even the stars seemed to hang back, watching? At the edge of the firelight moved Pavati Red Elk, Taza's daughter, though she never stepped fully into its glow. She was 20 years old, and she carried herself with a quiet grace that did not ask to be noticed but gathered attention all the same. Her hands were busy with a kettle, her movements precise and practiced, as if every gesture had learned its place long ago. When she lifted her eyes, they held something steady and searching, like water that remembers the shape of the land beneath it. She did not smile at Hanska, nor did she look away. She simply saw him, and that alone felt like more than he was used to. Hanska had noticed Pavati weeks before, though he would have denied it if anyone had asked. He noticed the way she listened when others spoke, the way she offered what was needed before it was requested, the way her presence softened a space without shrinking within it. Once, after a long ride under an unforgiving sun, she had handed him a canteen without a word. Their fingers brushed for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and the surprise of it had stayed with him through miles of empty land. He told himself it meant nothing, that such moments were accidents of proximity, but his chest remembered it differently, holding onto the warmth like a secret. Taza leaned forward then, the firelight deepening the shadows across his face, and the space between him and Hanska felt suddenly smaller, as if the desert itself had drawn closer to hear. His voice, when he spoke, was low and even, carrying neither command nor softness, but something far heavier. "You have walked among us without trying to be more than you are," he said, and the words settled on Hanska like a measured hand. "You do not take what is not offered. That is not a small thing." Hanska felt shame rise in him, sharp and familiar. He thought of the times he had been passed over, the unspoken judgments that followed him like dust, the way he had learned to make himself smaller so the world would not push back as hard. He had survived by working harder than required, by speaking less than he felt, by believing that endurance was the closest thing to worth he could afford. To be acknowledged now, here, felt almost like a mistake that might be corrected at any moment, and the uncertainty of it made his throat tighten. The question came softly, but it landed with the weight of a closing door and an opening one all at once. Taza asked if Hanska would choose Pavati as his wife, and the fire seemed to still, waiting to see whether the world would tip or remain balanced. Hanska's breath caught, not with joy but with fear so sharp it stung. Choosing meant believing he was allowed to choose. It meant stepping into a life where his absence would be noticed, where his failures would matter, where he could no longer disappear into the margins without consequence. Hanska did not answer right away. He stared into the flames, seeing not the future but the past. Lonely rides beneath indifferent skies, nights spent listening to the wind argue with itself, mornings where hope arrived and left without explanation. He thought of Pavati's quiet strength, of the way her presence made space rather than claiming it, and he wondered if he would only bring his emptiness with him. The curiosity inside him turned inward then, reshaping itself into a question he could not ignore. What kind of man refuses a life because he is afraid to live it? Before dawn, Hanska left the camp without a word. He mounted his horse and rode out into the pale stretch where the desert loses its color and waits for the sun to return it. The ride was long and silent, marked only by the rhythm of hooves and the steady circling of his thoughts. He passed broken fences and abandoned scrub, reminders of things left unfinished, and somewhere along the way he came upon a horse caught in a snarl of wire. He dismounted without thinking, freeing the animal with slow, careful hands, speaking softly though no one else was there to hear. When the horse bolted free, Hanska felt something ease inside him, as if choosing care, even unseen, mattered more than he had believed. As the light shifted and shadows shortened, Hanska turned back toward the camp. His fear had not vanished but it had changed shape. He understood now that accepting the question did not mean claiming certainty or promising ease. It meant agreeing to be seen, to be judged, to stand where his presence mattered. That understanding settled into him like a quiet resolve, fragile but real, and he rode with steadier hands because of it. Dusk found him returning to the fire, dust on his coat, humility in his posture. Taza looked up, reading the answer in Hanska's eyes before it was spoken, and Pavati paused in her work, her breath catching on something she did not name. Hanska spoke simply, without flourish or pride, offering not perfection but commitment. He said yes in a voice that did not tremble, and in that small sound something shifted, subtle as the wind changing direction. There was no celebration, no raised voices or sudden laughter. The camp seemed to exhale as if it had been holding its breath, and the night settled back into itself. Pavati did not rush forward. She stood where she was, her gaze steady, absorbing what had been chosen on her behalf and perhaps, with her in mind. When she finally stepped closer, it was not to claim or to test, but simply to stand beside Hanska, close enough to share warmth, far enough to honor the space between them. The life that followed did not announce itself with ease. There were looks from town folk that carried suspicion, whispers that questioned belonging, days when the weight of judgment pressed hard against both of them. Yet there were also mornings filled with shared work, evenings where silence felt companionable rather than empty, and small gestures that stitched trust together piece by piece. Hanska learned what it meant to be needed, not for what he could fix or carry, but for who he was when he stayed. Pavati learned that choosing did not always mean speaking first, and that strength could live comfortably beside patience. Taza watched them from a distance, satisfaction settling into him not because tradition had been fulfilled, but because dignity had been preserved. He had not given his daughter away. He had entrusted her future to a man willing to grow into it. As seasons turned and the desert showed its many faces, Hanska no longer felt lost within its vastness. He felt rooted, not by ownership, but by belonging earned through quiet courage. I think often of that night and how little it seemed to promise at the time. There were no guarantees spoken, no vows made beneath stars, only a question asked and a man brave enough to answer it without certainty. If there is a lesson buried in the dust of that memory, it is this. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is accept the life being offered, even when they are not yet sure they deserve it. And sometimes, that single choice is enough to turn survival into something that finally feels like living.